We have to give ourselves some grace and we have to understand that we're flawed, but we have to be able to pick ourselves back up and know that
Mhm.
if we wake up, that God has something more planned for our life.
Dorinda Walker is a nationally recognized equity architect and inclusivity innovator whose career spans corporate leadership, media, and philanthropy. She's the president of Expectant Media and the author of the book Protected by Purpose. Dorinda is known for breaking barriers and building bridges. She champions equity and cultural impact across industries, and her work has been celebrated by Forbes, Congress, and the Network Journal, honoring her as a transformational leader dedicated to empowering communities and inspiring the next generation.
I feel like it's important to know where you came from and to honor the legacy of those who sacrificed before you. And I thought to myself, if my great grandfather could come to the United States with literally nothing and become a millionaire, then what's stopping me when I have all this opportunity?
Today, Dorinda joins us to talk about her journey through corporate America, the lessons that shaped her, and why legacy leadership and purpose matter. Dorinda, welcome to the show.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here. And thank you so much for the opportunity. I love to share my story and inspire others. So looking forward to our conversation.
Oh, awesome. So let's start with your story. At the beginning, what first inspired your journey into the space of equity inclusion and creative innovation?
When I started my career in corporate America, I started as a temp in a financial services company. And as I worked my way up, I just saw that there was so much inequity of wealth. Um, I learned about my great grandfather becoming, he came from St. Kitts at the age of 16. He immigrated to New York, landed in Newark, New Jersey, became a millionaire in the 1920s and 30s in Newark. And I thought to myself, it can't be a coincidence that I work for one of the largest financial service companies in the world and that my great grandfather has this story. And I didn't learn about it until I was like 35 years old. I happened to have my grandfather and his sister over, and they talked about how they, had chauffeur driven limousines to school and they had maids and butlers. And I'm like, well, how could that be? Because y'all was Black living in Newark. And they said, oh, very flippantly, we were rich. And so they told me the story of my great grandfather. He owned two supper clubs. Sarah Vaughan went to his music school.
Wow.
She actually asked to be buried next to him, so she's 2 plots over, and I had no idea that that was part of my legacy and my heritage, and so I said, "Let me write a proposal as to why the company I work for should, start to market to people who look like me," right? Because I would go to events and I would hear stories about how white families were using life insurance to build generational wealth and investing in real estate and stocks and bonds and mutual funds and all these investment vehicles with these diversified portfolios. And I said, why can't I use my talent to provide education and awareness to my community? And so that's how I started on the path to equity and inclusion. And I grew that into a $100 million business for the company.
And knowing your legacy, do you feel that knowing your legacy was a pivotal moment in your life as far as the direction you decided to go in? Is that what I'm
I
hearing?
I absolutely believe that because I feel like it's important to know where you came from and to honor the legacy of those who sacrificed before you. And I thought to myself, if my great grandfather could come to the United States with literally nothing and become a millionaire, then what's stopping me when I have all this opportunity? I work in a Fortune 50 company. You know, I'm smart. I'm a go getter. There's nothing really holding me back from pursuing my dreams and honoring the legacy of my great grandfather because unfortunately, that generational wealth did not pass on. Right. And so, how can I break the barrier and start to educate my children and my grandchildren? And hopefully, they say my name 3, 4, 5 generations from now and still understand the legacy of my great grandfather, which I make sure that my kids know. In an age where our history, our stories, our contributions are trying to be erased, it's important that our children and our grandchildren understand where they come from and all that we've accomplished.
Absolutely. And it helps us know our worth, remember our worth, who we are. in our place in this
Wow.
world. What do you think is one of the issues with the breakdown in generational wealth? Why do you think that it stops and doesn't flow down the pipeline to other generations?
I
Or
think
just
it's
one family?
education. Yeah, I think
Mm,
there's a combination of education and culture.
mm,
So in the United States, we're in this instant gratification culture. Like we want everything fast. We want what we want, and we're not willing to sacrifice a lot for it. Particularly when you look at social media, there's these images of people living these lavish lifestyles when in reality, 90% of it's not real.
mhm.
People want that, they want to live that life. So they're not willing to sacrifice and live below their means to save and invest and think about long-term strategy and how they can leave a legacy for their children and their children's children. So we definitely have a cultural issue, but then there's also an education and awareness issue because a lot of times we don't talk about finances in the family. I know for my generation, it was taboo. We don't talk about what's going on in the household. We don't talk about money, and so how do we ensure that we're preparing our children and our grandchildren if we don't talk about finances and we don't talk about, how to save. We don't talk about the importance of investing and taking advantage of your company's 401k if you're in corporate America or starting, an IRA account very early. I was fortunate too that I did have my great grandmother told me about the importance. She said, "Girl, as soon as you get in corporate America, just sign up for that
Mhm.
401k and don't think about it." And I did. And so I'm so glad that I did because it worked out really well for me and all the other
Yeah.
investments that I learned about along the way.
And then you pivoted in your career. Can you tell us about that pivot?
Sure. So I had, after 20 years of working in financial services, I was experiencing a lot of macro and microaggression. And because I was very successful and good at what I did, and it came with, for lack of a better word, hateration. And I was being told that, my peers don't respect me because I self identify as Black first and a woman second. And, told that if I get nominated for another award, I should recommend someone else, another colleague. It was things like that,
Mm,
and, I drove into work one day after 20 years and said, "I don't wanna go in."
yeah.
So I wrote a letter to the CEO explaining about what my experience was, and we negotiated my retirement. I left corporate America, and I did it very scared because I
Uh,
didn't know what was gonna happen. I didn't have really a plan. But I knew that God was closing that door, and I had to have faith that he was gonna open up a new door of opportunity. My family and my friends were like, "Girl, you gonna leave that six-figure job and that big title?" And I had to say, God didn't bring me this far to let me fail, and at what point do I protect my peace and my sanity?
what point do you protect your peace and your sanity? That's powerful, Dorinda, because so many women, so many Black women, and so many people, just in general, stay in jobs because of fear, and it impacts their mental health. They have
Yeah.
more doctor visits than vacation time. What did you learn in corporate America that helped shape who you are today and how you show up in other aspects of the work that you do?
Now, I talked about some of the downside, but what I will say, what I cherish about my corporate experience is I learned the learning. I learned so much about how to be a leader. I learned a lot about, I honed my craft as a marketer in corporate America, learning because I don't have a formal background in marketing, but I excelled at it, right? And so it allowed me to use my gifts to really figure out what I was really good at and how to propel those gifts into a long-term career opportunity. I learned about the power of relationships because your net your network really determines your net worth, right? And so I also learned about the power of giving. So there was a point in my career where I had stalled and I kept focusing on when am I gonna get promoted? I'm doing all this work. And then I had to change my mindset and say, let me just focus on the work. Let me focus on the ability that I have to help others. Because I was in a position where I could write checks for people for sponsorship and help Black media and multicultural media. And so I said, let me just focus on the work. And when I changed
Mm.
my mindset, that's when God gave me all the blessings. Because and one thing I understand about purpose is you can't do it for the accolades or for your own self gratification, right? And that's just my opinion. You have to look at things from a place of service. How can I help? How is my work making an impact to serve others? And when I was laser focused on that, that's when I kept getting promoted, promotion after promotion after promotion. And I think that was God's way of telling me, you have to be ready for all that comes with promotion. Because when you go from manager to director to VP and then another level of VP, actual work, like the daily tasks, aren't as important as the relationships you build, dealing with the politics, dealing with, all the internal pressure that you have, especially when you're succeeding as a Black woman in a white male dominated industry. And so you have to be prepared for that. And I think because I was working from a place of service, I was unapologetic in the charge. And the fact that I understood the business, I knew that my work had to generate income, sales and revenue for the businesses, whereas no other marketing unit did. But I knew that I did in order that the work that I was doing was valuable. So, I hope I answered your question.
You did. I tell you, and it just makes me think about my time in corporate America, and I'm thinking about all the people who are listening and all the women who sometimes when you have your head down and you're working and you're trying to move to the next level and you're just praying that someone will recognize you when it's really about the bigger picture. It's really about, okay, servant leadership. It's about servant leadership and giving back.
Right.
And that's when doors open.
And being
That's
unapologetic about the work that you're doing and the contributions you're making. I find a lot of times as women, regardless of our race or ethnicity, we don't toot our own horn. And one thing I did notice working in corporate America, men would toot their own horn and half of them were mediocre. So you're accomplishing great things, and not to put them down, but it was something that I learned from watching men. They took their own horn and they talked about their accomplishments. And I said, well, if they can do it, I can do it because I really am accomplishing some stuff.
You have the receipts. The question becomes, how do you toot your own horn and still from a place of being humble? I think that's the challenge sometimes for women, especially Black women, right? We're hoping to be noticed and we don't want to
Yeah. Well,
spotlight on us.
I I come from a place, particularly now that I'm in my 50s, but this kind of really hit me when I turned 40.
Mhm.
I stopped caring about what other people think,
Mhm.
right? Because other people's opinions don't matter if God has already validated me. I wouldn't be in that position. I wouldn't have had the accomplishments had not God validated that I was capable and talented enough to do the work. So tooting my horn and worrying about what other people think about it, mm-mm, no.
Right.
You know what I mean? Because then that puts an added pressure on you. And when you're busy doing the work, I just don't have time to be bothered with what other people think about whether I'm humble, whether I'm bragging too much. Like, life is too short. And
Yes.
what I do know is that the people who are for you are gonna be with you and for you and cheer for you and your accomplishments, and you're always gonna have haters. If you don't have haters, you're not doing something right.
Yes, yes, I love that. And I think that's so true. It resonates. It definitely resonates. If you had to think about advice that worked for you or just based on everything you've learned, do you have any advice for someone who is coming up the ranks, who's working hard, they're toiling and struggling with walking and doing the work unapologetically, as you mentioned?
My advice would be to be laser focused on the work, to make
Mhm.
sure that you develop your own personal brand, because companies are not loyal to you. So it's important that you develop your own brand and have your own voice because that travels from company to company, or if you decide that you want to go into entrepreneurship. One of the greatest things that I think I was able to accomplish, and it wasn't even something that I sought out to do, but I'm grateful for it is to get on the speaker circuit, to
Mhm.
write thought leadership pieces, to become known as an industry expert and valued for my individuality and what I bring to the table versus a corporate speaking head.
Yes.
So I think your personal brand building is just as important as the work you do for that company.
Mhm, mhm. No, that makes sense. That definitely makes sense, and I think a lot of times we lose ourselves when we work for a company because we're producing work for the company, we're generating income for the company, and so we don't focus on, our brand, our personal brand.
And I
You
think it's
mentioned that.
can I just go back to that? Because I think it's particularly important for Black women because we
Mhm,
see what's happening with the, anti-DEI and the companies laying off, and particularly at the federal government level, and Black women bearing the brunt of the unemployment,
mhm,
and a lot of Black women are going into entrepreneurship, and this has been a trend for, over a decade. But having built a brand while you're in corporate America, I feel like helps you if you have to take that route because you can't get the corporate job anymore. So I think it's really, really important. I just wanted to say that.
mhm, I think it's important too, absolutely, I agree with you. It is difficult when you leave, and then building your having your brand established while you're working for a company helps when you decide to leave. And so you decided to leave. At that moment, we said, I can't take this anymore. That was crucial, crucial,
Yeah.
really big decision for you. You walked on faith. What did those days and weeks look like as you were searching for what was next or you were seeking what was next?
So I later learned that God was closing that door. Um,
Mhm.
'Cause I initially thought, okay, I'm gonna start my own business. I'm gonna do some consulting and I'm gonna do the same work that I did for that company for other companies as a consultant. And then when COVID hit, my husband got diagnosed with congestive heart failure. And so that consulting work I was doing, I had to put on a back burner. And then George Floyd hit, and
Oh, yes.
everybody was asking me to do DEI work because multicultural work is quite kind of closely aligned. But I didn't want to do DEI work. I felt it was depressing to me. I didn't feel like companies were serious. They wanted to check the box on, to say that they did something when they really weren't committed and really didn't want to understand what true equity looks like, feels like. And then my husband got sick and I had to put everything on the back burner. So again, it was because I believed in what God had next. And unfortunately for me, it was to care for my husband as he was transitioning. And so I lost my husband in 2022. I retired from corporate America 2019. So those 2 years were spent with him in and out the hospital. And, you know, it was just a tough time for me. And then I had a girlfriend call me and say, Dorinda, let's go change the media landscape. Let's go help Black content creators monetize their IP. And we started Expectant Media.
Okay. Oh, good
And
job.
within 3 months, we were generating multi-million-dollar deals with brands and helping content creators get, TV distribution and serving as a sales arm, and, it just took off. And so that was confirmation for me because God has always given me confirmation throughout my career, and throughout my life that he was there and that he would not let me fail. But that was a confirmation for me that God had my back. He listened to my prayers. He wasn't going to let me
Mhm,
fall. So he closed that corporate door because I needed to be there for my husband and my family. And then as soon
mhm,
as that door that door was closed, he created another opportunity that was bigger and better than I ever could have imagined. If you'd have told me in 20
mhm.
be producing television shows and generating multi-million-dollar deals, I would say you're crazy because I hated sales. Um, but here I am doing what I thought I couldn't do, but God showed me you sure can do it.
Yes, look at God. Look at God. I tell you, what a story, and I'm so sorry for the loss of your husband. And it's just beautiful to see that there's seasons, right? There are seasons in our lives, and God allowed you to spend time with him and then opened another door for growth and expansion. I tell you,
And I
that's
tell
powerful.
people about my grief journey, and I know everybody says sorry for your loss, but what I always tell people is don't feel sorry for me because I was with my husband
Mhm.
for 33 years,
God bless you.
had an amazing love story, 3 beautiful children. And
Nice.
I realized that I experienced something that a lot of people will never experience in their lifetime. So I feel grateful for that. And even though my grieving process was tough, and it's still a process, I still have my up and down days. And
Mhm.
I started on dating apps, and that's when I really realized how grateful I need to be that I experienced that kind of love in my life.
That's beautiful.
Yeah, dating apps.
Gratitude.
That's a we can have a whole nother conversation.
That's another that is another conversation. But your mindset through all the things that you've experienced, how were you able to maintain your faith through everything that you've gone through and be able to pivot from losing a spouse into a business? Because sometimes people get
Yeah. So I was the product of two drug addicted parents. They both suffered from drug addiction, and I suffered the consequences of their addiction. So from an early age, I've always had obstacles to overcome. My
Mhm,
dad went to prison for murder. My mom ended up meeting this nightmare of a man in rehab who physically and mentally abused both of us. I went from a straight A honor roll student, gifted and talented, to a high school dropout, drug dealer.
mhm,
Was
mhm.
definitely on the path to prison or death. And then when my dad died of AIDS in the '80s, I attempted suicide twice, spent 6 weeks in a psych ward. Oh, this is all before the age of 18.
This is before the age of 18.
Yeah. And so when you think about all that I went through there, and
Mhm,
then years later to say I was named by Forbes and the Network Journal as one of the top 25 Black businesswomen in the state of New Jersey, and I received all these accolades and proclamations for the work that I've done as a corporate professional.
mhm.
It allowed me to know that God has always been with me because but God, right? How can you explain
Yes.
me going from an at-risk youth to the life that I live now? It was nothing but
Mhm.
God. Um, and so I know that He's with me and that He will carry me through. And I think that's why I had success in corporate America because I mentored people who went to Harvard and Princeton
Mhm,
would be asking me, "How did you do it?" Because we're still struggling
mhm.
at this management level. And I think it was because of all of that I went through. It was the preparation for me to understand how to navigate corporate America because the things that a lot of people stress over were little things to me. I'm like, I'm not stressing over that because I'm not gonna lose sleep over that compared to some of the stuff
Mhm.
that I've experienced. And, you just build your armor over time and know that everything you've been through was the preparation for what God had next for you.
Yes.
And I could not give up. I just could not give
Mhm.
up.
You could not give up. Why couldn't you give up? What was fueling your passion to keep going forward?
Yeah, I think one is my feeling that it would be disrespectful to God and all that
Mm,
He's done in my life for me to now give up and say that I can't do it. Now, don't get me wrong, there's times when, like, during my grief process where I was severely depressed, drinking a bottle of wine a night, like, I
mhm,
was in a really low place, but I understand now that I had to go through the grief process because it is a
mhm,
process. Never losing like, in my mind, I knew that God would get me through it, but I had to go through the process, and I couldn't beat myself up about going through the process. We have to give ourselves some grace, and we have to understand that we're flawed, but we have to be able to pick ourselves back up and know that
mhm,
if we wake up, that God has something more planned for our life. And it's funny because there was a point about 6 months ago where God kept waking me up at the same time, 3 o'clock in the morning every night. And I just heard the voice of God say, I took Thomas because it was his time, but I wake you up every day because you still have more work to do. And that was the sign for me to get it together because I was doing just enough to function but I wasn't really living my life the way God intended me to, and the
mhm,
way my husband would want me to. So I had to say, like, how is this honoring my husband's legacy? Do I want my children to see me as someone who just gives up? And do I want to be a woman who's just tied to my identity as a wife and not as Dorinda Walker, the woman. And so, you got to have a lot of introspection, a lot of talks with God, and then I did this training, this momentum training a few years ago. And the transformation coach was Sylvia High. And she took us through an exercise of fact versus belief. And that was one thing that I always carry with me because I was told as a youngster that I would never be anything and that, I would be just like my parents because of their circumstance. And then I started to believe that, which is why I went, to high school dropout drug dealer. But that wasn't a fact. That was a belief that someone was trying to instill in my head. But the fact was I was capable, I was smart, and there was nothing that I really couldn't accomplish if I put my mind to it. That's the fact.
Mhm. Yes, yes.
Right? So you gotta learn to separate facts versus belief. So the belief that I could not function without my husband was false because the fact was he married an independent woman, a go-getter, an achiever. And even though he's not with me physically, he'll always be with me spiritually to cheer me on. And so to me, that's the fact. And I need to be able to move on and to accomplish the things that God wants me to accomplish when he wakes me up every day.
Oh, I tell you, talk about resilience. Resilience, Dorinda, what a powerful story. I want to talk a little bit about your book, Protected by Purpose, how the transformation from hopelessness and despair can lead to an extraordinary life. What inspired you to write the book? I know I heard a little bit about your story earlier. We've heard that. But tell us more about why you decided to put it on paper and make it tangible for others.
So it was never part of my plan. So when I was in corporate America, I sponsored a lot of faith-based conferences because we had a faith-based initiative. And I was at a conference with Pastor uh, and the Reverend Dr. DeForest Soares Jr., who's a mentor of mine, and another pastor, Bishop Cheryl Brown. Uh, and we were having tea. And I shared my story with them. And I never shared my story with anyone in corporate America because there was a shame attached to it, and I didn't want my peers to judge me. But for some reason, I shared my story with them, and Dr. Sawyer said, "You should write a book." And I was like, "I write a book? I want people to know." So then he called me like a week or 2 later. He's like, "Dorinda, I want you to speak at my women's conference at the church." And I'm like, "What? I'm not a pastor. I'm not gonna bless those ladies." So he said, "Girl, just come on in here and tell your story." So I said,
Mhm.
"Okay." So my corporate form fashion, I did the PowerPoint and I was like obsessed over it. Sent it to him. He said, "Girl, it's no PowerPoint. You're just gonna get up there and tell your story." And so I had to laugh at, because I know he was laughing at me. But anyway, I got up in front of 200 women, told my story. It was a 30-minute, talk, and then literally 50 women stood in line and waited up to an hour to speak to me. And the first woman said, "Nobody knows this, but I've been contemplating suicide, but after hearing your story, I know that's not what God wants me to do." The next woman was, "Nobody knows in the church knows this, but I'm struggling with addiction, but I'm scared to come out." So it's story after story that these women were sharing because they could relate to my story in some kind of way. And I said, "Well, maybe I should write the book because if just me sharing my story for 30 minutes has this type of impact, imagine what I could do to a national audience." So and again, this was just God preparing me because when I decided to write the book, I got a book deal within 5 weeks, and it took me 5 weeks to write the book, and it was in, airports across the country and distributed.
Bless you.
You know what I mean? So I knew this was part of the journey and what God wanted me to do. And what I realize about my purpose now is God uses me to inspire others in some way in whatever I do. So whether it's the work that I do with Expectant Media and helping content creators, monetize and share their gifts, mm, helping other influencers and, celebrities or non-celebrities have a platform and a stage to be part of this, to build their brands. That's part of my purpose work. And, so I am gonna be writing another book about the grief process. People want
Sure.
to talk about because Protected by Purpose ends when I'm still in corporate America, but people want to understand the journey outside of corporate America and my grief process. So I'm gonna write another book about that. And I just feel like A lot of times people hold shame. They're
Mhm,
scared about what other people are gonna think about their stories, and what I've learned is you own your narrative, you share what you feel comfortable sharing, and a lot of times when people can relate to your experience, it helps them. You inspire them to know that they're not the only ones who are going through it.
mhm, mhm. Yes. That's so true. So true. And you are an inspiration, Dorinda. Thank you for sharing your story and
Thank
giving us so much context around the work that you do. So I'm hearing that you feel in this moment that you are walking in what God has called you to do.
Absolutely. So one of the things that I'm really proud of right now is I'm fortunate that, the woman who founded HBCU Honors, which is one of the platforms that, Expectant Media supports and is actually a strategic partner in, she asked me to be the executive director of the HBCU Honors Foundation. And
Congratulations.
thank you. And so one of the first things I did was start a, internship program for workforce development where we help young students, you know, um, go behind the scenes with production and, just learning from everyone in the business on how to succeed in media and entertainment. So it's hands-on experience. They get to work on a major BET production. And for me, it's so fulfilling to see their faces and the excitement about what they're doing. And so I'm just really excited about building more programmatic opportunities for younger folks within the HBCU
Mhm,
community. And then also maybe some business training for alumni who want to be in media and entertainment. And who knows, as we develop and build relationships with brand partners, I feel like that's really impacts work. And so I'm really
mhm,
excited
mhm.
about that. And then just with the show itself, it's meant to, showcase HBCU alumni, make great contributions and to get back to students. And in the time we're living in and with all of the negative news,
Yeah.
get to work on something that inspires millions of people.
Yeah.
Just great content that's a reminder of who we
Mhm,
are, what we've overcome, how great we are, that we are valued, that we are powerful, that we lead culture, and so I'm just excited about that. And to me, that is purpose work.
yes, yes. You sound excited and it sounds exciting. And so I want to talk a little bit about creativity because everything you've done so far has this creative aspect because you were created by the creator
Mhm.
and he's using you to do just amazing work, the impact. So creativity seems to be a driving force in your life. How has creativity shaped the way you lead, solve problems, and continue to innovate?
Well, as a leader in corporate America, you're always coming up with an obstacle or a challenge. And I think one of the things that I was really good at is trying to figure out how do we get to the solutions. What I found a lot too is a lot of people will complain about things, but they wouldn't offer up solutions. And I think it's just something innate in me that I don't want to focus on the problem and complain about the problem. Let's figure out how to overcome it. Let's figure out how to fix it. I remember when I was a director in multicultural marketing, so I had worked to develop the business plan to start the division. They told me, Dorinda, you're not qualified to lead it, so we're going to bring someone in from the outside. Her and I bumped heads, and she
Oh,
was actually trying to get me fired after 14 years of a stellar record in the company. She came in trying to get me fired. Anyway, that's a long story, but she said, "I'm going to give you $100,000 for a sponsorship budget. What are you gonna do?" And I said, "I'm gonna put the whole thing in TD Jakes MegaFest." And she smiled at me and she said, "Okay, I'm gonna sign off on it because you're gonna get fired because you're not gonna generate any ROI." And so pulled our resources together, me and the Black folks in the company, and we said, "How can we
mhm,
make this bigger and better than anything they've ever done?" And $7 million in
mhm.
sales later, whoop, what
Wow.
happened? I became the VP and she got fired.
Talk about strategy and God. Wow. What's for you is for you. In this time, this day and age, how can how can women keep going? How can people keep going with everything that's happening around them
I think
in their lives?
we have to find our tribe. We
Mhm,
have to focus on the joys in life and not all this negativity. One thing I'm proud of with Black women in particular is we are finding ways to protect our peace because we did the work when we needed to, although nobody wanted to listen to us.
Mhm.
So
So
now we're
true.
finding our tribes, we're finding joy, we're focus on the things that matter to you because this too shall pass, right? And so just hone in on the things that bring you joy and happiness, because every day we wake up, there's going to be a problem, there's going to be some news story, but we can't let it take over the positive things and the blessings that we have in our life. I'm a firm believer in, you know, doing daily affirmations, you know, and then also I wake up every day and thank God for at least 5 things in my life. Whether it's the firm mattress that I slept on like a baby the night before, whether it's my daughter getting promoted, whether it's, not having to cook the night before.
Mhm.
There's always something that you can be grateful for. So learn to be grateful. I think that's really important because a lot of
Mhm.
times we're so busy that we don't take the time out to really think about all of the blessings that we have. We tend to focus on the problems, and we're always going to have problems and we're always gonna have blessings. I'd rather focus
Mhm.
on the good because the problems, we'll figure them out. We always do.
Yeah, we always do. And with God on our side, cannot fail if we stay focused. If you had an opportunity to speak with your younger self, what would you say?
If I had an opportunity to speak to my younger self, I would tell her to own her brilliance, to not be afraid to speak up, to not be apologetic about who I am. One of the things that happened to me in corporate America, I was scared to death to speak on stages, right? I was scared of public speaking. And if you'd have told me that I'd be speaking on stages to, thousands of people, I tell you, I would have told you it was crazy if you'd have told me that when I was 20. But what I learned is you have to overcome your fear. If it scares you, that means that the blessing is big.
Mhm.
It really means that the blessing is big if it scares you because everything that really scared me and I did it anyway turned out to be a blessing that was bigger or better than I could ever imagine.
Great advice for then and for now, right? For all of us, and for our listeners.
And
What do you want your
one more thing I would tell my younger self. Don't try to keep a door open that God is trying to close.
Oh, say that again, because so many of us, we don't
Yes.
want the door to close.
Yep.
Yeah, so true. What great advice. What do you want your legacy to be?
I want my legacy to be that when people think about me, that they think about how I helped them, how I made them feel, that I was a giving person with my spirit, that I made a difference, whether big or small.
Mhm.
Because was it Maya Angelou who said people won't remember, what you gave them, they'll always remember how you made them feel?
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
so I want my legacy to be that whenever I had an interaction with Dorinda, it was positive and that she was someone who was really a servant leader and really tried to help others and change things for the better.
That's amazing. Is there anything that you would like to share that I haven't asked?
Follow me on social media to see, all of the things that I have going on. I walked away from social media, when my husband was sick and I just started
Mhm.
more active and I share inspirational messages and people have reached out to say how glad they are that I'm back and that I'm sharing. So, let's just create a tribe and a community and celebrate one another and uplift one another. That's
Mhm.
what I want the rest of my legacy to be in the work that I do. Like just uplifting and finding peace and finding joy in the little things and the big things.
Amen. I just want to say thank you for being a guest on the show. Thank you for sharing your journey, all of your experiences. I know you're an inspiration to me, and I know you'll inspire our listeners. Thank you so much.
Well, I appreciate you for giving me the opportunity. I'm always humbled when people, ask me to do these interviews. Um, and you know, really value my experience and what I have to share. So thank you.
Thank you for tuning in to today's episode. I hope you left feeling inspired and energized to follow your own path with purpose and creativity. Don't forget to subscribe, leave a review, and until next time, keep creating, keep dreaming, and keep living your purpose.